Hello, everyone. My name is Philip Conklin. I'm a PhD student at the University of California, Santa Cruz in the History of Consciousness Department. And thank you for listening to my talk today on Philippine folk and the Christian mystical tradition. A similar refrain echoes throughout 20th century scholarship on the Philippines. Despite a tenuous veneer of Catholicism, the essential religious life of Filipinos was largely unchanged by the introduction of Christianity. At least that is for the common folk. As the Jesuit psychologist Jamie Bulatao once put it, pithily summarizing a consensus view, the Filipino is still an animist at heart in spite of 4 centuries of Roman Catholicism. That is, beliefs and practices that are in their outer form Catholic and whose practitioners call themselves Catholic, nonetheless more closely adhere to pre-Hispanic animist practices at their core. God and the saints were simply incorporated into an already existing pantheon of spirits and deities and negotiated with through the same kinds of animistic practices. Missionary activity in the Philippines began in the mid 16th century, and the country is still around 80% Roman Catholic. Despite the devoutness of the population and the persistence of Catholicism through these centuries, the incomplete, improper, or failed conversion of the natives of the Philippines to Christianity is a constant theme in scholarship. There are a variety of historically and theoretically nuanced analyses of the origins of this syncretic, heterodox, or so-called folk Catholicism. Perhaps the most prominent historian of Filipino Catholicism is the Jesuit friar John Schumacher, whose widely cited essay, Syncretism in Philippine Catholicism, Its Historical Causes, argues that it was a lapse in the continuity of Christian ministry caused by conflicts between the clergy and the Spanish state that caused the initially thorough conversion of the islanders to lapse into animism. Schumacher argues that while baptism was nearly complete among lowland Filipinos outside of Mindanao, that is in the central islands of the Visayas and the northern island of Luzon, within 2 generations of missionary work, and while these baptisms were sincere and wholehearted, the transformation of the church into a tool of social control by the Spanish state left much of the Philippines suddenly without properly trained priests. In this context, quote, the surprising thing is that the faith survived at all, not that it became contaminated with superstitions or pagan elements in a kind of syncretism, unquote. In other words, it was not the result of any miscommunication between the two parties, nor of the resistance of the natives that produced this syncretic religion. Rather, political miscalculations on the part of the Spanish state caused the initial success of Christian proselytization to slide backwards into paganism. That analysis stands in marked contrast to that of another highly influential work, Vicente Rafael's Contracting Colonialism. Raphael argues against the Christianization or Hispanization thesis of earlier scholarship, the view that Filipinos absorbed some elements of Spanish and Christianity, which produced a kind of hybrid culture between the two, and instead argues that instances of incommensurability or untranslatability lay at the heart of the missionary encounter. The Spaniards attempted to translate Christianity into Tagalog terms, but this process produced an irreducible remainder that the Filipinos were able to appropriate and refashion to their own ends. Translation, in other words, worked both ways. He writes, the Spaniards' efforts to translate Christian doctrine into the native vernacular transformed the vernacular and in time the consciousness of its speakers. Similarly, the Tagalog's attempts to read and appropriate Christian colonial discourse in their own language tended to change the meaning of that discourse and hence the very shape and feel of the colonial legacy as a whole. Raphael's analysis is more theoretically sophisticated than Schumacher's more straightforward historical account, and his conclusion is subtle but profoundly at odds with the older scholars as well as with much of the previous work on Christian conversion in the archipelago. His argument essentially is that Filipinos converted to a Christianity of their own making. Christianity appealed to Spaniards and natives alike, Raphael argues, because he writes fragments of it remained irreducibly foreign to both. And this irreducibility constituted an outside that lent itself to being differentially interpreted by both ruler and ruled. It is through this interpretation of the irreducible outside that Tagalogs contracted colonialism in the double sense of transacting with it and also shrinking it, decreasing its scope. In other words, he writes, the Tagalogs submitted while at the same time hollowing out the Spanish call to submission. Different as this is from the syncretism thesis of Schumacher or the Hispanization thesis of earlier scholars, Raphael's argument is consonant with other explanations of folk or syncretic Catholicism in that it relies on the existence of disjunction between Orthodox Catholicism and Filipino life worlds. Instead of the lapse or contamination posited by Schumacher, we have instead a creative appropriation. But the result is more or less the same, the adherence among Filipinos to religion other than what the Spanish intended to pass on to them, other than Orthodox Catholicism. So, whether classed as a deviation or a contraction, whether deplored or valorized, the fundamental fact of the existence of a not quite official Catholicism in the Philippines remains more or less constant throughout the scholarly literature on the archipelago. And these are just two of the most famous examples of this. This trend is not surprising considering that this has also been a concern of the Catholic establishment since the arrival of Christianity to the region. Raphael explains that according to the written testimonies of the early missionaries, the zeal with which most Tagalogs seem to have adopted the Christian faith was matched by their apparent failure to understand its true meaning, leading to some anxiety over whether the conversions were legitimate or not. Such anxiety continues up to the present as the church in the Philippines remains engaged in a continuous effort to regulate between the quote sensational the so-called sensational forms of Catholic devotion practiced by the common people and the official forms promoted by the Catholic power structure. The church's anxiety over the deviant faith of its unlettered members points to a larger problem with the idea of folk religion as a concept. That is, it is always invested in regulating the religious practice of the common people, the uneducated, the poor, and so on. Simply put, in the Philippines, as elsewhere, folk Catholicism is the realm of the folk. As Julius Bautista puts it in his study of devotion to the Santo Niño, a statue of the baby Jesus in Cebu City, said to date to the time of Magellan's arrival in the region in 1521. He writes, folk Catholicism is construed according to dialectic categories of class and geography. In this construction, the folk are effectively consigned to the domain of the rustic and backward, and are defined by their inability to transcend the dictates of their innately animist mindset. There is nothing essential to the content of a religious practice that makes it folk. Rather, it is the status of the practitioners themselves that serves to define whether what they do is official or popular religion. The appending of folk, therefore, is an instance of the exercise of institutional power. It is a definition that serves not only as an analytical category, but as a boundary marker between the proper and the improper that has a disciplinary function going beyond a particular text or particular way of conceptualizing people's devotions. This being the case, we might be better served by considering the work that terms like orthodox and heterodox do as a form of power and governance, instead of simply assuming that they exist as stable categories and then either denigrating or valorizing one side or the other. The fact is, Christianity is not an unchanging monolith to which practices and beliefs either do or do not conform, but a historically contingent tradition, indeed a conglomeration of traditions, whose boundaries and contours are always subject to debate and contestation among those who consider themselves to be its members. Filipino Catholics who make recourse to faith healers and propitiate spirits, who accord more value to emotional investment in devotions than to knowledge of doctrine, and who see no discrepancy between these practices and their status as Catholics, could be said to be entering the debate about what constitutes true Christianity. Indeed, Bautista reports that the so-called folk Catholics that he spoke to in Cebu explicitly say that the Filipino version of Catholicism is one that transcends the barriers between official doctrine and popular, if at times, idiosyncratic interpretations. A similar argument is made by Deirdre Dela Cruz in her book Mother Figure, Marian Apparitions and the Making of a Filipino Universal, in which she argues uh, in which she urges scholars to look beyond the local forms that religious practices take and to see the universal aspirations espoused by apparently geographically bounded processes. De la Cruz notes that local or so-called folk practices often reach beyond their specific contexts, exceeding the analytical grasp of the categories used by scholars to understand them. She writes, localization cannot account for everything, I discovered when confronted with Filipino devotional movements that seem to turn this formulation entirely on its head. With this in mind, she urges scholars to go beyond the local to see how, through such practices, new universals are imagined and made. The attribution of folk to certain populations and practices then reflects the reality that some groups have the institutional and political power to deem a certain version of Catholicism to be the universal and orthodox one, while others lack such power. One crucial point here is that the labeling of certain other versions of Catholicism as outside the official faith is a constitutive aspect of the establishment of orthodoxy. Folk or heterodox practices don't necessarily threaten the official dogma of the church, but rather serve to outline the contours of the faith at the same time that making such determinations reinforces the status of the church as the only institution with regulatory authority. In fact, Bautista argues that for the contemporary Catholic Church in the Philippines, tolerance of folk devotions is just as important as their prohibition or disavowal, and that tolerating heterodoxy both accommodates the devotions of some of the most dedicated Catholics, at the same time that it reinforces the authority of the Church. The contemporary Catholic Church hierarchy, he writes, acts not to deny the existence and persistence of animist beliefs, but rather to establish itself as the only valid source of legitimization. And this phenomenon is not unique to the Philippines nor to the colonial period. According to Bautista, the Christian religion as a category was created and defined by establishing the boundaries of what it is not, and by means of actively denouncing those forms of worship and belief that deviated from the path prescribed by the doctrine. In short, the classification and subordination of practices and beliefs that are heretical or folk serves to constitute the boundaries of the official religion, reinforce the church as the sole body capable of making such determinations, and discredit and subdue the aspirations, political and spiritual, of the lower classes. And all this should be borne in mind whenever the category of folk religion is invoked. This designation is never just a neutral analytical term, but a discursive mechanism through which religio-political authority is wielded. It's my argument, then, that in continuing to use folk Catholicism as an analytical tool, secular scholars participate in the disciplinary mission of the Church. Scholarly analyses of folk Catholicism, even those that valorize its practices, through their very form maintain the distinctions of elite masses, educated ignorant, and urban rural that have historically served to delineate the proper from the improper in the Christian tradition. This can be grasped through the simple point that no one calls themselves a folk Catholic, let alone a popular Catholic or a heterodox Catholic. Whenever folk Catholic is used as a category, it reproduces a power relationship between the subjects analyzed and those who know better, whether academics or church officials. The folk Catholic is therefore always a silent constituency, one that does not speak but must be spoken for. To avoid participating in this disciplinary apparatus, I argue that scholars should avoid altogether the use of folk Catholicism as a category. Instead, we should consider ethnographic or historical subjects in the way that they refer to themselves. In the Philippine case, this means as Catholics. If they are folk Catholics, it is because they have been attributed this distinction by those with more institutional or political power than themselves. It follows that to refer to them by anything other than what they call themselves, Catholic, is to participate in the historical project of divesting them of the power to define Catholicism for themselves, and in the contemporary period, to contribute to the political project of regulating religious life. Considering Catholics in the Philippines as Catholics without a modifier is, however, only a starting point. From this point of departure, we can embark on a different kind of task than the one most scholarship attempts. Bearing in mind all that's been said up to this point, we can now ask if the practices of Filipino Catholics are not inherently unorthodox, but rather one version of a Christian tradition which has not been authorized by the official powers that be. How can we consider this Filipino Catholicism not as a deviation, but rather a continuation of a Christian tradition? What I want to suggest in the remainder of this talk is that, in fact, Filipino Catholicism bears continuities with certain strains of Christianity dating back to its foundations, and that these continuities have not yet been analyzed by scholars because of the tendency, contrary to the claims of Filipino Catholics themselves, to treat Philippine Christianity as a departure from, rather than an extension of, Christianity. In what follows, I'll try to draw out some of these continuities that I see in the Christian mystical tradition, an analysis that I argue could offer a new paradigm for the understanding of Catholicism in the Philippines. In particular, I'll try to show how three elements of full Catholicism that are considered to deviate from doctrinaire Christianity are present in mystical Christian texts. These are the use of prayer over and above scripture or doctrinal knowledge as a means of engagement with the divine. Second, the importance of affect and emotion in devotions. And third is the conception of human beings as debtors in a reciprocal relationship with God. So first, prayer as a means of direct access to the divine. In his essay, Reflections on the Experience of God Among Philippine Folk Catholics, Bulatao writes, ever since Thomism assumed its primacy in Roman Catholic thought, it has become common belief among many theologians that human beings do not ordinarily experience God. Such theological conclusions nevertheless go contrary to the belief of the common people, whose experiences indicate a much closer experience of God's presence than the reasonings of theologians might suggest. In fact, Bulatao notes that the view of the folk in this regard seems more reasonable than that of their learned superiors. When one accepts the reality of an infinite God, Bulatao writes, who is everywhere and in everything, the view that such a God can be readily contacted seems much more plausible than a view that God is there but cannot be touched. The common sense of the common people seems more trustworthy in this regard than the rationality of systemic philosophers and theologians. Another version of the argument for the accessibility of God can be found in the 5th to 6th century Christian thinker known as Pseudo-Dionysius, whose writings have been hugely influential in the history of Christianity. Despite his extreme erudition and his writings' dense textual references to the history of Western philosophy, Dionysius's The Divine Names continually insists on the inadequacy of the rational intellect to approach God. He writes, all human thinking is a sort of error when compared with the solid permanence of the perfect divine thoughts. The most divine knowledge of God, that which comes through unknowing, is achieved in a union far beyond mind, when mind turns away from all things, even from itself, and when it is made one with the dazzling rays, being then and there enlightened by the inscrutable depth of wisdom. While Dionysius continually articulates the incapacity of the intellect to comprehend the true nature of divinity, he's a little cagey when it comes to the actual methods for achieving the divine union that he speaks of. But it's clear that prayer is at least part of what he has in mind. And other Christian mystics were much more straightforward about how to use prayer to go beyond thoughts and achieve communion with God. Much of the 16th century Spanish Saint Teresa of Avila's autobiography is devoted to practical instruction for the person who wishes to follow what she calls the way of prayer. Teresa guides the potential practitioner through 4 stages of prayer, describing the feelings a person might encounter in them, the experience of God that one can expect, and certain practical tips on how to comport oneself in each stage. This is mirrored also in St. Ignatius's roughly contemporary work, The Spiritual Exercises, a manual intended to guide Catholics on a 30-day contemplative retreat. Ignatius's guide for the exercitant includes directions on what and when to eat, how to direct one's gaze in the presence of others, when to pray, how to hold one's body during prayer, and so on. Scripture is crucially important as well to these exercises, but mainly insofar as certain passages serve as a conduit for a deeper experience of prayer, and less so as texts meant to be interpreted by the practitioner. In short, a lack of doctrinal knowledge and a reliance on bodily practices of devotion is considered a hallmark of folk Catholicism, as opposed to the staid liturgical reasonings of the official church. However, texts in the Christian mystical tradition show that prayer, conceived as a bodily practice, has been considered as a more effective way of communing with God, and that the rational workings of the intellect can actually serve as a hindrance for a relationship with the divine. Second is emotional devotion. In his book on the Santo Niño statue, Bautista explains that this little image of the baby Jesus, which is an object of devotion for Filipinos from all walks of life, appeals both to, quote, those who worship God based on the liturgical dictates of the scripture, and those who are thought to do so on pure sentiment and infatuation, unquote. Here we see a microcosm of the divide that Bautista analyzes in his book between the urban, educated, middle-class Catholic who is knowledgeable about official church doctrine and more or less conservative and subdued in their worship, and the rural, uneducated, lower-class folk who, quote, fill the gaps engendered by an inadequate understanding of Christian doctrine with elements of the superstitious, sensational, and fanatic, unquote. This is a common theme in discussions of folk Catholicism. While its adherents may not know the deeper meaning behind the theology they profess to follow, their devotions are more emotional and passionate than the more sophisticated believers. However, ardent emotional attachment to the divine has been an important theme in Christianity since its foundations, and especially in the European mystical tradition. The so-called love mysticism may have reached its apex with the 13th century Beguine mystic, excuse me, Mathilde of Magdeburg. Mathilde's flowing light of the Godhead presents the soul as the bride of Christ and takes the reader through a dizzying frenzy of visions and lyrical poetry, whose through line is the soul's utter adoration and devotion to God, the bridegroom, a love that is matched by the Godhead himself. Much of Mathilde's language and imagery would seem to be at odds with what we usually think of as religious literature. In language ranging from the sensuous to the graphic to the sweetly romantic, Mathilde describes an affective bond between God and the soul, which is, crucially, necessary to both parties. As articulated also by Pseudo-Dionysius, every being longs for God as its ultimate source and creator. Mathilde writes, "The nightingale must ever sing, because its nature is love. Whoso would take that from it would bring it death. Ah, mighty Lord, look on my need." Unquote. At the same time, God requires union with the soul as an outlet for his creative power, a receptacle for his divine abundance. She writes, God caresses the soul in 6 things. Thou art my resting place, my love, my secret peace, my deepest longing, my highest honor. Thou art a delight of my Godhead, a comfort of my manhood, a cooling stream for my ardor. Unquote. While the image is that of bride and groom and the language that of lovers, this does not, of course, describe a literal relationship. Rather, the emotional intensity can be regarded as a vehicle through which access to the divine is achieved. as Dionysius puts it, a capacity to effect a unity. So again, while the sentiment and infatuation that seem to characterize folk Catholic attachment to divine figures is often understood as a gratuitous derangement of true Christian teachings, we can see that this mode of relating to God has a long history in Christian mysticism. The final continuity I wish to suggest, that of humans as debtors to God, is perhaps the most unlikely, considering that it's an aspect of folk Catholicism that seems to be an idiosyncrasy wholly unique to the Philippines. Raphael's contracting colonialism contains a particularly useful and perceptive analysis of the way that the Spanish Catholic concept of God's relations to humans was domesticated by the Tagalogs and incorporated into their existing social relations. Societies in the lowland Philippines, the areas where Spanish missionary activity was successful, at the time of the arrival of the Spanish, these societies were hierarchical and structured around relations of debt and reciprocity between unequal parties. Society was divided into basically three classes: elites, free citizens, and debt peons. And these existed in a continuum of indebtedness in a hierarchical fashion. The person at the top of the social order owed no debts. The person at the bottom was the most indebted to others, and the rest existed somewhere in between, with a complex web of dependency linking the various members and levels. An indigenous Tagalog concept that's often deemed characteristic of these kinds of debt relations is utang na loob, the inner debt, literally inner debt, or debt of gratitude that forms a crucial place in Tagalog social life, structuring relations of exchange and reciprocity among individuals. The archetypal utang na loob is the debt of gratitude owed by a child to his or her parents, a debt that can never be fully repaid, but which requires constant servicing, small acts of deference that continually reinforce the unequal relationship between the two individuals. The crucial point is that the relationship goes both ways. It's not one of strict dependence or of oppression, but one in which the two parties both have something to gain. The parent is given the deference and loyalty deserving of their superior position, and the child is given the comfort and protection due to one in their subordinate position. And the same has been said of all unequal relationships in Tagalog society. The leader of a particular group is accorded respect and obedience from his followers, but this is earned only to the extent they are able to secure the surplus needed to keep the community fed, adjudicate disputes among members, protect them from outsiders, and so on. One of Raphael's interventions is to argue that Tagalog converts to Christianity, rather than adopting the position of believer that the Spanish attempted to teach them, instead simply incorporated God into these existing relations of reciprocity. For example, instead of the process of confession as a laying bare of one's sins in order to have the soul cleansed, Tagalogs made of it a bargaining with authority in order to ingratiate oneself in a reciprocal relationship with God, wherein obedience is exchanged for protection and favors. In Raphael's adept hands, the miscommunication becomes almost comical, a prime example of the way that the incommensurabilities between Spanish Christianity and native Tagalog society allowed the islanders to submit, quote, while at the same time hollowing out the Spanish call to submission, unquote. However, while there were certainly local aspects of the Tagalog social world which would have affected their understanding of Christianity, especially when its concepts were translated into terms in the native languages, Raphael's description of reciprocal relations among these 16th century Filipinos is not quite as discrepant to Christian tradition or all of Christian tradition as it might first appear. In his discussion of yearning as emotional attachment to the divine, Pseudo-Dionysius quotes his teacher, Hierotheus. Quote, when we talk of yearning, we should think of a unifying and commingling power which moves the superior to provide for the subordinate, peer to be in communion with peer, and subordinate to return to the superior and outstanding. The text translator explains that this conception represents a pattern found frequently in this corpus. Superior beings relate to inferior beings by providing for them, inferior to superior by returning to them. This would seem to suggest that there existed already in the Christian tradition a way of relating to God not dissimilar from what Raphael and others describe in the social order of lowland Filipino societies before Spanish arrival. Indeed, Dionysius's schema of relations between beings includes not only humans and God, but other classes of beings as well, both below humans and above humans. So, as in Tagalog society, we have a hierarchy characterized by relations of reciprocity between unequal parties, where subordinates give deference to superiors and superiors support their subordinates. If Raphael is right, then, and 16th century Tagalog converts to Christianity incorporated God and other Christian divine beings into their existing framework of reciprocity, they would appear to have conformed more or less closely with Pseudo Dionysius's vision of the celestial hierarchy. In this regard, it's also interesting to note that Christian mystics also use a language of debt to describe their relationship to God. It's not hard to imagine that just as parents are owed an insurmountable debt of gratitude from their children for having given birth to them, God is owed an even more insuperable debt as the source of being, the infinite creative force which is the medium in which existence manifests. Saint Teresa, for example, speaks of the great debt that she owes God, a debt that increases according to the favors he bestows upon her. This could be thought as a kind of ultimate utang na loob, where even an instant of recognition by God is enough to exceed the soul's ability to ever repay it. Nonetheless, the more these favors are dispersed, the more Teresa insists on the soul's resolve to recompense its creator. She writes, "May it be your pleasure, O Lord, that the time may come when I shall be able to pay you at least 1 farthing of the great sum I owe you." Excuse me. In short, the way that Christian mystics conceive of communion with God, unio mystica, is as a relationship between non-equals, where certain practices and dispositions incur upon the higher party the bestowal of rewards and favors to the lower. In this way, it appears to me to be similar to systems of debt and reciprocity that structure lowland Philippine social life. And in this way, their inclusion of God in these systems can be thought of not as a deviation or syncretization of Christianity, but as a continuation of certain aspects of a Christian tradition. To conclude, my intention here is not to suggest that reading Philippine Catholicism through the Christian mystical tradition is the definitive way to understand it, nor to suggest that Filipinos have some inherent inclination to mysticism. What I hope to have demonstrated through this comparison is that there are ways to understand Catholicism in the Philippines that doesn't take its incompleteness or heterodoxy for granted. As such, this kind of analysis should be applicable to other regions of the world where so-called folk Catholicism, or indeed any folk religion, is practiced. This kind of approach has at least two distinct advantages over the standard approach, as I see it. First, it takes the self-understanding of its subjects seriously. Again, no one calls themselves a folk Catholic. And since Filipino Catholics, like all others, understand themselves to be part of the long tradition of Catholicism, as scholars, we should do our best to try to place them within that tradition, rather than enumerating the ways they are outside of that tradition. Secondly, this kind of approach is better able to see the way that religious practice in the Philippines has transformed through time, rather than finding a way to picture it as stagnant and unchanging. In The Cult of the Saints, Peter Brown wrote that it is usually assumed that the study of popular religion must be the study of continuity and not of change. The different forms taken by the religious practices of the common people are seen merely, as he puts it, as foam on the surface of the lazy ocean of popular belief. When we assume that popular religious practices are simply so many variations on the same unchanging underlying theme, We miss the nuance and specificity of religion as it is understood and practiced by its own adherents in a particular time and place. Above all, what I'm suggesting is that to jettison altogether the prefix folk from Catholicism or any other religion leads us to ask more interesting questions about popular religion. How is the worship of saints different from the worship of ancestors and nature deities? And what does this difference make available to practitioners? What kinds of universal claims are made by the apparently local and particular version of Catholicism practiced in the Philippines or elsewhere? How have Filipinos made the Catholic tradition richer? I hope that I've shown in this presentation why asking these kinds of questions might be worthwhile. Thank you for listening to my talk, and please feel free to contact me with any questions. Thank you so much.